This is Myron Chamberlain with Prime Lending, and thank you so much for joining us today. Myron, how you doing?
Super glad to be with you. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year. Appreciate it. Are you guys staying warm out there in Arizona?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Much
It's
warmer
always
than
sunny. It's
here,
always sunny in Arizona.
right? It's supposed to be always
Yep.
sunny here too in Florida, but it's been cold and rainy and gloomy. And
No, it's good. It's January's off to a great start. We're busy as quite busy. I think that that's a sign of things to come for 2024. It's going to be a lot of promise, I think, in the real estate and the mortgage field this year.
that's
Um,
great. How
and
does
a,
how does this January compare to like January of 2023?
I would say the enthusiasm level is a little bit higher.
Is it
Um,
okay?
yeah, it is. And the reason for that has been trajectory of rates. So starting October 19th was actually the date that rates peaked, and that was where they peaked at 8%. And everyone thought at 7% they wouldn't go any higher, and sure enough, they
hmm
went to 8. And
hmm
so from October 19th almost through the end of December, we had 90% of the trading days in the market were giving us better rates than the day before. So that cycle of downward rates brought a lot of enthusiasm to the market. And once they came back decisively into the 6% range, everybody thought they had just won the jackpot. And those that had been waiting said, I want to purchase. So it was a new year. Clients are wanting to get out, look at properties again, and capture the drop in rates that we've been seeing over the last 60, well, really 30 to 60 days.
If we're talking about so much volatility in the rates, whereas just a couple of months ago we were at the highest that we've been, what, in decades, does it make more sense for somebody to continue and wait until the rates drop back down to say maybe a 5% or something like that? Or should we just be buying right now?
Yeah, good question. Well, I think the enthusiasm comment that I made earlier is indicative to a small degree of what has just happened when they've gone from 8 down to mid sixes. But we're going to even see that 10x if they go from the mid sixes down to 5%. It's estimated that there's 5 million, 5.5 million Americans actually that would jump into the housing market if rates hit 5%. Well, we don't even have 5 million annual sales in the US right now. So that tells you there's a year's worth of buyers sitting in the wings waiting for those rates to come down. We all know what happens when that, we all know what happens when they come out and purchase homes. The supply goes way down, the demand goes up, and prices go up. And
Absolutely.
so I've run the math every which way. And if prices were to go up 10% in that example, which I think is a very real possibility, you're going to end up paying substantially more than if you were to wait for rates to go down between 1 to 1.5%.
And that's if you can even get the house. There's going to be so much competition at that point too.
Right now, on average, let's just say, for example, homes sell at 97 to 98.5% of list price. It was very common in Tampa and in Arizona to see in 21 and 22 that they were selling 102, 103% of list price. So instantly you've got a premium built into the home that you're purchasing, in addition to the fact that the seller is pricing it higher to begin with. In looking at the math, it makes so much more sense for someone to buy now, take the higher rate, wait for the demand to heat up for prices to increase a little bit, and then when rates hit the 5 to 5.25% level, they would then spend the $3,000 ish to refinance, or they would, most lenders, including ourselves, are offering free refinances if they refinance within 18 months of the
Hmm.
original purchase.
Okay, that's good to know. So if somebody, let's say, unfortunately bought in October with an 8%, would you
Mhm.
recommend that they refinance now? Or like, is there a time frame that they have to wait to refinance, or should they jump on it?
I would say is try as hard as you can to be patient. I think we're halfway into the marathon right now. And if you refinance now, you're going to be a little bit regretful that you've done so. Interest rates are very much tied to inflation. Inflation has given us a lot of signs through the two reports, the PCE and the CPI reports. Those are the two economic reports that give us the best indication of where inflation is. We've seen a lot of progress in those reports. The Federal Reserve has said when both of those indexes hit 2% on the core PCE and the core CPI, they've met their goal. That's where they want to see inflation. We're still currently above that on the core PCE and the CPI. However, if you average it over the last 6 months, we are at or very close to the 2% level. And the reason why it's not showing up in the numbers yet is because it's a 12-month average. And so oldest 6 months are being averaged with the newest 6 months, which is still putting us above 2%. But if you only take the current 6 month data, we're between 1.85 on the PCE and on the CPI, we're at 2.4%. So the Fed has almost achieved their goal of getting inflation under control. And once that becomes known within the marketplace, we're going to see interest rates fall as a result of that, more than likely, to the tune of about 1 to 1.5%.
Now, are you seeing an uptick in mortgage applications compared to a month or two ago?
Yep, without question. And nationally, just yesterday, the mortgage applications, that is a federal stat that gets released every week. And last week, mortgage applications were up 10%. It's a year over year rating.
Gotcha. So let me just ask you, let's say I'm a first-time home buyer. I don't know anything about what I'm doing. Do you have like programs that will help me out? And also, can you just briefly touch, is there a cost to start a mortgage application? Like maybe I'm not ready to buy, but I just want to get my ducks in a row.
To me, you can never start too early. It's an education process is what it is. When you call us, there's no salesmanship. You don't feel as though you're being sold something you don't need. It's an education process from start to finish. So you need to know as much as you can about the process, how it works. Are you ready? And the first step is really figuring out your budget. How much are you paying in rent? Is that comfortable? How much can that increase? And then what price of home would that translate into? Instantly, that takes all of the homes and opportunities available and boils it down to what's right for your budget and your family. So that's step one. There's no cost at all involved in that. I think a lot of people come to us, or they've heard a misconception, or they go to Google and try to diagnose what it looks like to buy a home through Google. And there is just so many differing opinions and bad information out there that it can be very easy to become discouraged with the process. So do not let down payment be a stumbling block. There is down payment assistance programs available where you can get your down payment granted to you to purchase a home. And so there's real examples of clients that we've helped that have bought a home and they make a deposit, they get their deposit back at closing. And so their out of pocket is zero in the best instances. At times you'll need to pay for your closing costs, but on the whole, the concept of 5, 10, or 20% down is an outdated idea. There's certainly better options available.
If I'm representing a client, am I able to get the seller to put concessions towards their closing costs on top of what you were just mentioning?
There's different grant levels. You can get 3, 4, 5% grant levels, sometimes even more. So for example, if you bought a home and used 3% down, but your grant was 5%, well, now you have 2% extra that you can pay for your own closing costs through the grant that you just received. In other instances, if you don't have the flexibility of that extra 2%, you can ask the seller to pay the 2% for you. So the seller is paying your closing costs, your grant is paying your down payment, and then all you're responsible for as a buyer is the cost of your home inspection.
If I wanted to go online and just try and figure out, how much I'm going to need to put down, or what my closing costs might be, or maybe what the difference is between an 8%, on 500,000 versus a 6% on 500,000. Do you have any of those type of tools, or is that just something that you can tell me what the differences would be?
There's a super easy formula that clients can use to figure out exactly what their payment is going to be, or very close to it. So just touching on the two of the primary qualifying aspects for down payment assistance, oftentimes a 640 credit score is where clients need to be for down payment assistance. There is some options down to 600, but between the 600 640 range, that's where they need to be. And then oftentimes there's income limits. Income limits usually cap out at approximately $130,000 for the household income. A payment is made up of 4 categories. The first is principal and interest. Then you have property tax, you have home insurance, and you have mortgage insurance. Those are the 4 categories. The principal and interest is the biggest, and that's what's paid to the banks. At a 6% interest rate, your principal and interest is $600 a month for every $100,000 that you borrow. So it's super easy math. 6%, $600 a month for every $100,000. It's actually $5 million.
Easy enough.
Exactly. Yeah. And then for every 0.5% rates go up, it's $30 per month. So at a 6.5% rate, you're $630 for every $100,000. And so with rates being between 6.5% and 7%, you know exactly what your principal and interest is going to be for every $100,000 that you finance. Then you just simply have to add in the taxes, the insurance, and between $40 and $60 a month for every 100,000 on the mortgage insurance.
Do you think that the interest rates will see a steep drop right before the election?
I would say no. In my experience, I've originated loans in the 2008, 12, 16, 20, so 4 election cycles, and there has not been a decisive drop in rates before the election. Now, I'm sure that both parties would like rates to be low for there to be, a vibrant economic cycle. But interest rates on the mortgage side, they function on an independent stock market, similar to the stock market. It's a different exchange, but there's a similar exchange that mortgages get traded on, just like the stock market. That is not controlled by the Federal Reserve. It's not controlled by the executive branch of government. So there is independence in the powers that are setting and the demand really that is being traded on them for mortgages. And so because of that independence, you don't see a predictable cycle.
Gotcha. So overall, what we're seeing is that, nobody has a crystal ball, but interest rates are trending downward and should hopefully continue to trend downward, even if ever so slightly throughout the rest of the year. Is that correct?
Yep. I would say by and large they would say that the long-term trend is downward. Within that trend, you have your ups and downs, so it's never a straight cycle. The Federal Reserve has come out and said they intend, if inflation keeps going the way it is, they intend to cut rates 3 times. The market believes they'll cut rates 6 times, so the market has already priced in 6 rate cuts. And originally they were thinking that would happen on the March 20th meeting. It's now debatable whether it will be that soon or not. But the Federal Reserve has clearly said they're going to take the Fed funds rate and start lowering that this year. When that happens, they believe inflation is under control. When inflation's under control, mortgage rates come down. And so that's going to be the primary driving factor that's going to influence our rate cycle quarter 1, quarter 2 of this year.
Mm-hmm. And when they do one of those rate drops, how substantial are they typically?
They always operate in 0.25% intervals. Only once in my career has it ever been more than that. And that was the day COVID broke. And they said, we're taking this to 0.
Yeah.
So they came out. That was just a one-time thing. We're going to 0. It's always 1/4 to 0.5%. Anything more than that is an abnormality. So when they increased rates and they started the rate cycle of increasing it after COVID, they were increasing it in 3/4 point intervals. That was like they've never done before. They did 3/4, 3/4, 3/4. And so they were very aggressive in their rate cycle increase, perhaps more aggressive than ever before. But typically it's 1/4 to 1/2. And then the next meeting, it's 1/4 to 1/2. So this year they have 8 scheduled meetings. So within those meetings, we'll probably see between 3 and 5 of those meetings will produce a rate cut. Keep in mind, that is not mortgage rates per se, but that will lower rates on home equity lines of credit. It lowers rates very next day on car loans. It lowers rates on credit card loans. Any loan that has a variable rate cycle or is tied to a short-term rate comes down the very next day. And so you will see some relief on those forms of financing when the Fed starts lowering their rates.
So even, help me just understand this correctly. So even if I have an adjustable rate mortgage, that will actually change downward if they drop the rates?
Adjustables, no, typically not, because most adjustables are fixed for either 3, 5, 7, or 10 years. And so if you're within that fixed period, the government lowering rates is not going to influence your rate. But home equity lines of credit, often known as second mortgages, those are tied to prime, and the prime rate is currently 8.5. Prime is directly affected by the Fed funds rate. So they take the Fed funds rate, add 3%, and that's prime. So you'll notice relief on second mortgages and home equity lines of credit.
Okay.
But you will not notice an interest rate on an adjustable rate mortgage, since that's tied to a different index. I just think it is so critical. I just believe so firmly that it's unbelievable the wealth I've seen created through people that just get off the fence and buy. Mm-hmm. And whatever we can do to encourage people, make your first purchase. And what I really like to help people understand is that the hardest time they'll ever have making a mortgage payment is always the first year. And when they get that and they realize this whole mindset that once you have your payment, that payment is good for 30 years. And if they were to ask their parents, hey, I know you bought your house 20 years ago, what's our mortgage payment? Assuming they hadn't refinanced, or if they did, they said, our payment's $800 a month. You always look back and you always are amazed at how cheap things once were.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have that mindset in place on your house, it puts a sense of urgency on there saying, I better get this started as soon as possible because I want to be part of that cycle as far back as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And I mean, I encounter first-time home buyers all the time where their biggest thing is there is a mindset that is just kind of, out there that you need to have 20% down on a house plus closing costs, and that in order to get into a property of any kind, you need to have a whole bunch of money up front, right?
Yep.
And that's not the case anymore in a lot of situations. So, you've got your FHA options, you've got all kinds of different conventional options.
Yep.
And so you can get into a property with little or no money down.
Yep.
And, if you take, so I've been paying rent for, let's say I'm 30 years old and I've been paying rent since I was 18, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I have nothing to show from that. I've just continuously paid that off. Now, if I had just sprung and bought a house, and you're going to have some additional maintenance costs, and things will come up over the years, and that's just a part of home ownership. But if you look back at a home that you bought 12 years ago, well, now you've paid down a huge chunk of the mortgage, and the property in most cases has also appreciated greatly, which a lot of times will end up being like having a second job by doing nothing, just by owning a home. And so, most first-time home buyers, they don't quite understand that. But people who have been through the process and have owned, it's the best thing for anybody to do. It's just to go out and just buy something and just live in it.
Well, you're exactly spot on. And that's why the government wants inflation. Everyone thinks no inflation would be great. It's not great, because then there's no sense of urgency to do something, because they say, well, I'll just do it in 5 years. It'll be the same price. You want some form of inflation to create a sense of urgency to get out there and buy today. And when you look at inflation, inflation plays out at least three ways when someone buys a house. This is what very few buyers understand. Inflation affects the purchase price. So that means that every year it's going to be a little bit more expensive to buy that same home, presumably. Some years it's 0 to 1%, other years it's 20%. But on the whole, about 5% a year, prices are affected by inflation. So that's number one. Number two, there's wage inflation, and that's a positive to a borrower. So if they're making $50,000 this year, really good chance they're probably making $52,000 next year and $55,000 the year after. And so wages are always getting increased, meaning it's always going to be easier to make that original mortgage payment because that's not tied to inflation. And then the third form of inflation is rent inflation. And this is so often forgotten among renters that are considering home ownership. And in that example of a client that we just closed who was paying $1,400 in rent, I forecasted for her based on appreciation trends, what would it look like if she stayed in that $1,400 rental 5 years from now? And in 5 years, that $1,400 becomes $1,767. So her rent has gone up almost $400 a month, which was very close to what her mortgage payment would have been if she had bought 5 years before. And so 5 years ago, she would say, well, I don't want to buy. My payment's going to be $500 more. But you have to look forward to the future and say, well, I know that in 5 years, my rent's going to be more than that because it never stays the same. It always goes up.
Yeah. And now what's her house worth 5 years later, too?
Yeah. So I ran that exact same scenario. I said, let's just go a very conservative 5% appreciation. We know historically it's about 6, but let's just go at 5. And in her case, she bought a very entry-level townhome. It was $205,000. So that means at the end of her first year of ownership, it would be worth $217,000. If you think about that, that means she's literally earning $1,000 a month because she owns versus rents. And so at the end of the 5 years, that $205,000 home becomes $274,000. So she has a $69,000 increase in value over that same 5-year time frame.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, running the numbers, it makes way more sense. And a lot of people don't think about the fact that rents are also increasing too. So every single year you've got your insurance costs that go up. You've got property taxes that go up, right? So even in order to have the same coverage, you still have to pay more money. So therefore, rents have to increase as well. Rents are not going to stay the same, but your mortgage payment is going to stay the same.
Correct.
Right? So eventually rents will be more than that mortgage, which is what's happening all the time.
Spot on. Exactly right. And that is worst case, saying mortgage is going to stay the same. They'll never go up, but I've never been in this business. I mean, in this business over the last 16 years, I can't think of a cycle longer than 4 years where rates haven't gone down significantly enough for one to not refinance.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if your payment in that example that we gave was almost $500 more on the rent versus the mortgage payment, your mortgage payment is likely coming down by 15 to 20% when you refinance, thus bringing you closer to what the rent would be. And then your rent is always going to be going up 5% a year. So I can't think of too many examples outside of a 5-year window where owning a home wouldn't return you fivefold over what you would have if you were to remain in that same rental. And that doesn't even account for the principal pay down or the tax savings.
Well, thank you so much. Myron, how do we find you?
At MyronChamberlain.com. We'd love to talk to you, love to help you. Cell phone is always on through call and text 480-358-7801, 480-358-7801.